Welcome to a conversation about the Common Core State Standards. Thank you for joining us this morning for our professional learning opportunity online. My name is Tony Flock. I'm National Practice Director with Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and we will be having a conversation with Chris Lehman today about Common Core State Standards, particularly English Language Arts. But first, a few logistical considerations. As it looks like the audio is working, you do have a choice of how to be connected to the audio. You may use voice over internet protocol, or you may use your telephone and dial in. Please note our protocols, folks. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please don't hesitate to send those in using that question feature that you just used there. This is going to be one-way audio. We've muted everybody's microphone so that there's no background noise or distractions. If you have private questions, feel free to email me at tony.flock@hmhco.com or contact Chris Lehman on his website, christopherlehman.com. A copy of this PowerPoint will be available approximately 48 hours after we complete it at our website, leadandlearn.com/resource center. If anything that we talk about today intrigues you and you would like to find out more about the Common Core State Standards, a couple of upcoming learning opportunities for you. In New Orleans, Louisiana, Common Core State Standards Summit 2.0, getting ready for the next generation assessments, where our experts will tell you all about the new assessment practices and what the change in rigor means for both your instruction as well as your assessment practice. And then if you'd like to find out more about math and ELA, and you've had our prior trainings, we have the Train the Trainer models, or our certification training for both math and ELA Common Core State Standards in Las Vegas, Nevada from December 2nd through December 4th. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Christopher Lehman. Chris is an international speaker, education consultant, and author or co-author of several popular books, including Pathways to the Common Core with Lucy Calkins and Mary Aaronworth, Energized Research Reading and Writing, A Quick Guide to Reviving Disengaged Writers, and Falling in Love with Close Reading, Lessons for Analyzing Texts and Life with Kate Roberts. Chris's articles have appeared in many publications and popular blogs, including Voices in the Middle, Smart Brief, and EdWeek. Chris has been a middle school teacher, a high school teacher, a literacy coach, and for 7 years a staff developer with the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project at Columbia University. He now works with schools around the world as a consultant and frequent keynote speaker, supporting educators, coaches, and administrators in developing rigorous and passionate literacy instruction across content areas, and is a perfect fit for us here at the Leadership and Learning Center in Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, because we are all about passionate learning. Chris is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, went on to receive his master's in teaching at NYU, and his EDM in Education Leadership at Teachers College and Columbia University. You may follow Chris on his Twitter account at @ChrisLehman, and his blog, ChristopherLehman.com. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining us today. We sincerely appreciate you being here. One of the hot topics that we hear all the time when we're out in the field, when we're doing conferences, is really a brewing controversy around the Common Core State Standards. You can't go anywhere and avoid that topic. You are and also we'll be glad to be welcoming you to our Common Core Summit November 5th and 6th, so looking forward to seeing you there. You've written about the Common Core in Pathways to the Common Core, and you speak and write about this very frequently. So what is some of your current thinking around Common Core State Standards and instruction?
Thanks, Tony. I'm very happy to be here. I agree with you. I think in schools that I work with and conferences that I attend, there is this feeling of being overwhelmed, of wondering what's going to come next. People are really nervous about the standards, and so I actually want to start this conversation by saying what the standards are not. The Brown Center from the Brookings Institution put out a report in February 2012. Each year they have a report on American education. And in that report, part one of the report was about the effects of the Common Core standards on student achievement. They were trying to predict into the future using historical data on how standards in the past have affected student achievement. And what's fascinating is they came to the conclusion, and this was just as the standards were really beginning to roll out, they came to the conclusion, based on historical fact, that the standards will have little effect on student achievement themselves. They found things like the quality of individual state standards had no correlation to how students achieved within that state, that regardless of where cut scores were placed after standardized tests were taken, the cut score placement did not affect achievement in the following year. That standards really didn't mitigate achievement variations across subgroups inside of states. And really fascinating to me that regardless of the quality of standards across states, and even with the Common Core trying to sort of equalize standards across states, that within state differences are actually greater than across state differences. So schools within New York or Georgia or anywhere, there tends to be more variability between schools than actually taking each state on average across them. And so they end their report with this, and I think it's an important place to start our conversation today. They say, the empirical evidence suggests that the Common Core will have little effect on American students' achievement. The nation will have to look elsewhere for ways to improve its schools. So goodbye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
hold on.
Right.
Everything that I've heard, I've read that folks are talking about is about how much of an improvement the Common Core state standards are for the vast majority of our states. So what you're saying, what Brown Center is saying, is that the standards themselves aren't enough?
Yeah, and I think you're making an excellent, important point here. I do think that the standards for many states are an improvement over what there were before. I'm originally from Wisconsin, and I've spent most of my career now here in New York. And I will say, when I look at New York standards, the old version of the standards, no one knows them. There's so many bullets that fall underneath them. It's really hard to hold on to them or to really make them useful in instruction. I do think the standards themselves, the document itself, does a really elegant job of having a small set of standards that everyone across the country can talk about and think about together. I think what the Brown Center is saying, and I think something I deeply believe, and in my previous years with the Reading and Writing Project, they believe, and I think many educators believe, is that ultimately the standards themselves are not magic. The Common Core will not make or not make what your students do any better or worse. It's really, we're the magic makers. The educators are the ones. It's the implementation of instruction. It's what we do with that. And so I think part of this debate and worry over the standards, oftentimes we're the most nervous in our classrooms when we ourselves, or when administrators or our state departments are sort of giving us protocols to follow, or ways that we're supposed to teach. And I understand that's where people are getting nervous, because it's making the standards, instead of a really elegant set of expectations, it's turning the standards into instruction, or it's turning the standards into a particular way that you need to work. And I just really don't think that that's the case. So I do think it's important to start here saying the standards themselves won't change a thing. It really comes down to what we do with them. If we use them as a tool to see our kids more clearly, that ultimately is what will move them along.
So the standards are what we teach, but it comes down to how we teach.
Exactly right. I mean, that brings me to, I think, a next point here. Research from John Hattie in his work Visible Learning and Visible Learning for Teachers. He's undertaken the largest meta-study of education that's been to date ever done. He's now looked with his team at, I think, something over 900 meta-studies. So 900 studies of other studies. I'm really trying to see what are the factors that align to student achievement. So what are the things that we can do, that we ourselves, the magic makers, can do to move our kids along? And one of the most important factors that he comes to, the one that comes up again and again in research and practice, is feedback. And the way he talks about feedback is it's not just what we say to students. Instead, it's a feedback loop. And I think it's important for our listeners here today to think, what are ways that you in your school and in your classroom are creating a feedback loop? And the loop is sort of saying this. If Sarah is a great writer, one way we could look at Sarah's work is to say, wow, she's great. Of course she wrote a really great narrative. Instead, we can look at Sarah's writing and say, Sarah's a student in my classroom. Her writing's really great. What were the factors that I did in my instruction that led to that? And it's the same thing if Jessica is a bad writer. We could look at her piece of writing and say, oh, she's a bad writer. She's not a good student. That's why her piece is not so good. Or we can look at Jessica's writing and say, her essay is that way because of my instruction. So I can look back at my own instruction. I can use students' work as feedback to my teaching, and I can make decisions from there. So I think there's major areas, and I want to suggest 3 that are really important for looking at feedback.
Do you mind if I interject real fast?
Oh, sure, of course, yeah.
I want to clarify. So what you're saying is that the student's performance is both the product that they've created gives us an opportunity to provide the students with feedback, but it also provides feedback on the effectiveness of our actions?
Absolutely. I think that's the most essential piece, that when we see what students have done, it's more than saying, oh, good, they completed the assignment, right? And it's more than saying, oh, well, Johnny got a D because Johnny's not so good at school. And instead it's thinking, so what factors did we use in our instruction that led to that? I mean, I kind of think of the Leadership and Learning Centers, that framework that you have of are you lucky your students perform well, but you don't know why? Or are you really leading that your students are performing well and you understand why? Like you've really studied the factors that have led to their achievement or to their struggle.
So this feedback loop that you're describing, I think I agree with you 100%. It really does remind me of the Leadership and Learning Matrix, where educators link what they do with what they get as measured by the performance of their students. And folks, if you'd like to find out more about the Leadership and Learning Matrix, please don't hesitate to check out our website. We have several pre-recorded webinars about that. But Chris, I think you started to mention 3 big factors.
Yeah, so when you look at the work that our students are doing, I think ultimately one way that we move our students towards the achievement that the standards are expecting is that we make use of this feedback loop as much as possible. And so I just want to offer 3 questions that we can ask ourselves and our school about our instruction. So one is, are we giving time for practice? If our students spend most of the period, and I'm not suggesting that anyone does this, but I'm in a lot of schools. I know this is a transition that many schools are making. If our students spend a great amount of time being led by the teacher, so perhaps they're in a lesson where the teacher's asking a lot of text-dependent questions and it takes up the entire period of text-dependent questions, if most of the time is students with the teacher, it's very hard to get sufficient feedback from what students can do independently so you can make decisions about their next steps. So one question is, are we providing a sufficient amount of time for practice? Do students have long lengths of time to actually do reading and do writing and do math and do science so that we as teachers can observe what they're doing and use that as feedback to our own instruction? I think question number 2, are we in our own classrooms or in classrooms are our colleagues providing feedback and taking multiple opportunities to provide really clear and explicit small next step feedback for students? If our feedback only comes in the form of a red pen on paper or only comes at the end of work that students have done, it's really difficult for students to see their own work, but also for us to be involved in that feedback cycle. So you want to think of the work that we're building in the standards is not a set of outcomes. It really is a set of habits. And so we want to provide feedback along the way. Think of students, if they're like learning to ski, a good ski instructor watches you along the way and provides tips as you go. The ski instructor doesn't just send you to the top of the hill and sits at the bottom and then says, yay, you made it, right? Like they're helping you along the way.
Good coaches, good art teachers, good music teachers.
Exactly right. Like you're right there along with you, and it's the same in all of the subject areas. And then the last question is, are we looking more at products or are we looking at transference to independent practice? Are we looking more at what students did at the end, or are we really watching how they work by themselves with our teaching? And each one of these questions, are we providing enough time for practice? Do we give enough opportunities to feedback? And are we really transference-minded, not just compliance-minded? All of those really allow us not only to give feedback to students, but I think more essentially it gives us feedback to ourselves. If I could give one quick example. So with transference, for example, with the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, they suggest that you think about giving your students on-demand assessments. So it's before you teach students to write an essay, you ask them to write an essay cold. And at the end of that unit, when you've taught them how to write an essay, you ask them to write another essay cold. And you compare those from the start to the end. That independent practice is what students can do on their own. That piece that you worked with them on for several weeks is really you and them writing together. So are you, inside of your school, looking for opportunities to see that transference?
Excellent, Chris. And folks, if you have questions, please use that question function to send them in. I believe Stacy's got her hand raised, but Stacy, if you could type that question in and we'll reply to it. And Chris, that takes us to our first poll. I'd like to get a sense at this point of where you all in the audience are feeling, you know, what needs to be your next step, your next instructional focus for your classroom, your school, or your district. And ladies and gentlemen, I neglected to mention a very important member of our team. Kathy Shulkin is kind of like our woman behind the throne from The Wizard of Oz. She controls all the behind-the-scenes magic. So Kathy's posted our poll for us here. We see the responses coming in. If you'll take just a moment there. Chris, as these responses are coming in, though, what it occurs to me is to do these things, we need time. We can't give kids time to do all this practice, to coach and provide the feedback and the transfer for every single standard. You know, are there some, is that your sense as well, that some of these are just more important than others?
Yeah, I think I sort of feel two ways about that, because one is, you're absolutely right, the time we have is the time we have, but we can decide what to do with that time. So you might be a middle school teacher that has 42 minutes every day to teach everything. You can decide, and many schools do, many schools I'm lucky to work with do, you can decide that 20 minutes of that 42, or some days 30 minutes of that 42 minutes will be kids independently working. And that way you can work with small groups of children or one-on-one. It's not easy, right? It's not easy, but I also think growing students' lives is not an easy thing to do either. So it really is about making purposeful choices.
Okay, folks, we're going to give you about
I think I'm going to close the poll, Tony, and Chris. I think we've got some great response, and I'm going to share the results.
So
time for feedback.
Gentlemen.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I see in classrooms. And I want to say, if that, I think all of these are essential pieces in the work that we do, but I do think that point C, that increasing the quality of feedback, so not just opportunities, but the quality of it, is so important. And I think there's many ways to do that. I think one of them is the more conversation that you can have with colleagues while looking at student work or while observing student actions in a classroom together, the better you get at your own feedback. The more you're collecting writing or listening to students that talk, and together describing it, together trying to say, so what are the qualities of that conversation that make it strong or not so strong? It just equips you with more language, more things that you can say and do in terms of providing that feedback. So I'm excited to see that that's a big focus for people.
Excellent. And folks, again, please remember, send your questions in as you have them. Don't hold them to the end. We'd like to, Chris and I both would like to have an opportunity to respond as we go through. So, Chris, you know, we at the Center have spent a lot of time studying the impact of nonfiction writing on student achievement. In fact, the use of nonfiction writing-based assessment is one of the key factors that we found in our 90-90-90 schools research. And we really do see it as an essential practice for enhancing student learning. You've also studied nonfiction reading and writing practices for your book, Energized Research Reading and Writing. In the book, you suggest ways educators can rethink this process of teaching kids to do research. Could you talk about that for a bit?
Sure. I think I'll take these ideas of time for practice, time for feedback, time for transference, like really allowing students to show us what they know, to use my work with research as an example of what you could do with anything in your classroom. Think about, I guess right now, if I told you it's really important, the standards say you should teach research, how would you feel about that? If you're like a lot of teachers, there's a large percentage of us, right, exactly. There's a huge percentage of us that think that's the worst thing you could do with your time. And I think part of that is we think about our own experiences around research, and frankly, a lot of our experiences around research were not those first three things we talked about. It was a lot of, here's exactly what to do, here's how to do it. I was standing at the card catalog with a box of note cards. It was the worst thing you could ever do.
Wait, you're dating yourself with the card catalog.
Right. Oops. I went online. That's right. So what I want to suggest with research instruction, but frankly, this is for anything, is what we most need to do in the era of the Common Core standards is to think about our instruction as it authentically lives in the world. What are the independent things that we do so we know what we can study? So for example, if you research in life, when you're sick, you ask everyone, you go online, you get second opinions. If you're trying to find a new book to read, you ask your friends, you go on websites and blogs, you read reviews. When it's time to vote, we all do research in many different ways. When we are authentically, independently researching, there's steps that we go through, there's habits that we take when no one's handed them out to us, when no one has said, here are the exact steps that you need to go through. So what I suggest is you think, whether it's research or anything else, what are the habits that we have when we're authentically doing these exercises? We're authentically using these habits. We're authentically doing what the standards are suggesting kids can do, and turn that into your instruction.
Sorry to interrupt, but Danielle just sent in a question. As we're talking about research and my teasing you about the card catalog, Danielle asked, how much research should be print-based versus internet-based? What are your thoughts on that?
That's an excellent question. Again, I think we should come back to what do we authentically do, and then I think there's also the side of, so, developmentally, where are your students as well? So I think to not involve some digital research across grade levels, I'd say especially at the higher levels, moving into middle school and high school, but frankly, there's a huge number of educators that even in kindergarten are having their kids, go together to websites or, look at videos online. I think it's crucially important, and the standards echo this, that the work that our kids do in research is not just text-based. I think you may have more text in younger grades than you may in older grades, because there's, you have more of an ability to kind of control the selection a bit, like they have less of a choice than just the endless internet. But that's an excellent question. I do think we need a good balance of that. Which then, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and that's going to be some of how they'll be assessed in some of these new Common Core state standards from Smarter Balance and Park, those kinds of assessment. Won't they have to do that kind of research?
Exactly right. I mean, I was, in my free time, I've been taking Smarter Balance practice tests that are now online. And it's very fun. And there is a portion of it
where... That's why we get along.
Exactly, because we're big nerds that way. They do have, there's audio that you listen to where there's no print. There's digital text that you need to choose between. In the upper grades, you have to almost go into your own Google site and try to choose between a variety of links that pop up and decide what are the most appropriate ones. So I think that's an excellent question and another important shift. But again, I think that comes back to when we design instruction, we first need to think, what do we authentically do ourselves?
So what's that mean for how we teach these things? What's that mean for our classrooms?
Yeah, so I want to say, and I know this is brief in our conversation today, but here's an example. So what tends to happen now, at the start of research, kids tend to have an assignment. There's oftentimes handouts involved. You have a state assignment. You have to, on this page, write your state's name, and on this page, write your state's bird, and on this page, write your state motto.
State project.
Right, exactly.
That one.
Exactly. And then what do students move to? They often get texts, and then they take those texts and just copy out of them and plagiarize. And then at the end, they turn all of those facts that they pulled out into paragraphs. They just kind of shove it all together. If we think about seeing students' independent practice, observing what they can do themselves so that we can make teaching decisions about them, I think there's shifts that we need to make in our instruction. And all of this comes from studying ourselves. So I think at first, instead of just handing out the blueprint for what kids should study, think, what do you do when you're researching? When you don't know what new phone to buy, you start out with just the giant topic. I need a new phone. And it's only through gathering a variety of topics and texts that you're able to then narrow that down. If we allow students the opportunity to do that, to show us what they can search for first, it gives us teaching ideas. We can say, oh, wow, they don't know how to use a library at all. I can teach into that. Or, oh, wow, they have a huge set of books, but half the books they can't really read at all. I need to teach into that. Secondly, once kids have their books, what they tend to do is take notes just to prove that they know things. So they'll open
I found it on the page. Here it is. Copy
exactly
and paste.
right. I did the assignment. This is what you said. Authentically, what do? We read. We're thinkers while we read, and our notes are best when they're notes on our learning. They're not just notes on the book. So like one example, one thing that you could do if you study yourself is you could ask kids to first take some notes on books, observe what they do. You're noticing the feedback to you is, ooh, they just copy text. So then you make a teaching decision from that. So maybe you teach them to read a little bit, then cover up the text, think for a moment. So what are some big things I learned from that page? And then take notes off of their learning, not just what the book said. And then lastly, I think one of the shifts to think about is when kids are writing nonfiction, they oftentimes are writing, again, to prove that they've read. I think really what we need to teach into, and what the standards, frankly, are asking, is that we're teaching kids to write to think. And a way to do that is to teach them to write to teach. So instead of just writing all the facts I know about whales, I, as the writer, what you can teach me to do is to think about whales, then think about what I want to teach other people about whales, and then use teaching techniques to do it. So I can make comparisons, I can define vocabulary. I really want my writing to be a conversation with a reader. The standards expect that students think about audience, task, and purpose while they're writing. If you're writing to teach someone else, not just to write for yourself or to prove that you've read, that's another way to do it.
Boy, Chris, you've kind of hit a vein there with folks. We got 3 questions, comments right here. Amina writes about how much she appreciates the things that you're describing here, because it's about increasing knowledge in writing and understanding more on what a student needs to research. Mary writes that a lot of research on improving student writing focuses on struggling students, etc. What specific ideas, she asks, are there for students who are already proficient at their level to move them further along? Not just gifted kids, but any kids. It becomes easy to be complacent. Hey, they're doing it all right, and we focus on the struggling, and then we'll get to Michelle's question. So what are your thoughts for helping those kids who already do a fairly good job at writing?
And I love the way that you talked about it too, Tony. I kind of think of Carol Dweck's work about mindset, that, sometimes our kids who are already really proficient can say, well, I'm already good at this, so I'm going to.
I have arrived.
Exactly, and what they do is brilliant, but there's only, they don't really move beyond their brilliance, right? Like they're already sort of there.
Yeah.
And I mean, one thing I think about is how, as the standards increase in complexity across grades, but frankly, because the standards are a continuum, kids don't only have to work on the grade level standard, right? Like your kids who are 4th graders performing more like 6th graders, you can look at the 6th grade standards. But what I think the standards do in a really beautiful way is, as informational writing increases across grades, it sort of blurs with argument writing, that there's kind of more opportunities to bring in a point of view, more opportunities to really state a claim. And so one thing I'd suggest, just standards-wise, is looking across both of those categories for your kids that you feel like are really achieving at the level that you'd like them to, and really introducing the idea that great expository writing doesn't just repeat facts. Instead, it really is trying to prove something. My colleague Kate Roberts had this great line. She said, I think when you look at expository text, oftentimes people struggle with, well, there is no bias here, so I can't really, teach bias or argument or do any sort of argument work with it. And she said the thing that people often don't realize is, in straight expository text, the point of view or the argument or the point they're trying to make comes from the selection of details, deciding which details to include and which not, right? And so, exactly right. So I think it's that. I think it's helping our stronger researchers think about their research as more of an argument. Frankly, that's what good science work is, right? Like scientists argue their point of view through their research. It's not just about relaying facts to people. It's really trying to forward a point of view.
Okay, and then we had a question from Michelle. When you were talking about teaching into books for kids that can't read, could you elaborate on that for just a minute before we go to our next poll?
Yeah, sure. So that opens up a large can of worms that we could have a whole other webinar on. I think
next week.
Yes, next week. Perfect. Let's sign up. I think the mystery of the Common Core, the thing I struggle with, and a lot of us that do reading research and rereading research, is this mystery of complex text. So I have to say this. Handing kids text that they can't read does not teach them to read text better. So I think one thing we have to teach into, and I'm not just saying that as my opinion, that's like decades of reading research and classroom practice supports that. That when our kids are struggling with text in research, the first thing we have to teach them is how to select text appropriately. And that doesn't mean they can never read more complex text. I think one thing that you teach them to do is to, what we all do, kind of make a reading plan for yourself. If I am trying to figure out a health problem for a loved one, I'll start with WebMD, and if that doesn't make sense to me, I'll actually back up and go to YouTube, and I'll keep backing up until I find information that I can understand, and then I'll go back up in complexity again. Nonfiction offers us the opportunity to do that. Those skills don't necessarily transfer from topic to topic, but within a topic, I can set up a reading plan for myself. And there's a variety of other structures, but I think that's one good place to start.
All right, so folks, as y'all are reflecting on your current instructional practice, we're going to throw up our second poll here, and again, Kathy's going to work her magic. But as you reflect on these shifts that Chris has suggested, which area are you most interested in studying further? And you see the 4 choices there. So Kathy's got our poll up. Take a moment, if you would, and post. But so Chris, as people are responding there, as you're describing the teaching into books, it sounds like we really need to heighten students' awareness of their own thought processes and figuring out for themselves what their zone of proximal development is.
Exactly right.
Just right book and where we go.
Exactly right. I mean, I think metacognition is so important, and again, it comes back to those opportunities for feedback. I think one essential piece of moving kids along is that we do have to explicitly teach things, but then we also have to step back and see what they do with it.
Okay, we've got about 76% of you.
Yep, we're looking good here. So another couple of seconds, and we'll close the poll.
Right. And don't forget, folks, thank you to Mary, Amina, and Michelle for your questions. Danielle, please keep those rolling in as we go. And looks like
we're going to close the poll, and here are
we got a tie.
The results.
Tie, perfect. And I think one important thing with these poll questions is it's not just what are you choosing, it's also that you're choosing something. I think of Michael Fullan's work where he says, schools and organizations don't rise and fall out of lack of will. They rise and fall out of the ability to either choose one specific focus and go with it, or they die on the hill of too many initiatives, right? And right, exactly. And so I think, and I'm sure those of you listening at home are now going, yes, there's too many initiatives. So I think one thing to think about with these poll questions today, and it's the sort of thing to do with your staff as well, is really to say, what's one area that we can really study together? They all are important. They all are things we can work on, but let's start with one area, perhaps even something we're already pretty good at, and then use that sort of feedback cycle to get better at it. So if you're trying to work on writing in more learning-driven ways, ask kids to do some nonfiction writing. Have them do many opportunities to show you what they know from your own instruction, and then study that with your colleagues. I think choosing a focus is one of the most essential things we can do right now in the era of too many initiatives.
So, Chris, along those lines of kind of choosing that focus, Leah sent in a question asking about how to really start the process more authentically. She writes, do you think generating essential questions at the beginning of a unit helps students start where the research begins? She asks, is that an authentic beginning?
That's a great question, which is a whole other webinar too. I feel multiple ways about those kind of like large umbrella questions that you start at a unit. I think it's a better way into independence than if you didn't have that sort of student-centered direction at all. But I also think ultimately what I want to teach into is how students are kind of, I want to teach into their own process. So oftentimes what I'll do in research instruction is to instead have kids start with just topics, really, like to say, what are things that I already know a lot about that I want to study more? What are things that I know somewhat about but I'd like to learn more about? And what are things I don't know anything about at all but I'm interested in? And then really a next step is to gather sources next, because I think that's what we tend to do. So you have all of those possible topics. You then go to your school library or classroom library, or you go online, and you begin to see, so what is available? And that helps you to narrow down your topic. I think the beginning is actually really fast and messy. I think the beginning is possible topics, get some sources, and then once you have the sources in your hand and you start to peruse them and look through them, then your essential questions for yourself begin to pop up.
All right, excellent.
And I wanted to, but before we move past research, I included this slide because one thing that I think actually goes along with maybe this last question is standard 7 in the writing standards, I think is really interesting and really critical, that they talk about you don't just do research once, that kids don't just have one really long research project, but instead you have a balance of short opportunities to research even outside of writing instruction, and compare that with large ones too. I think the more opportunities you take to do this sort of work across the year, the more feedback you get from your students.
Great question just came in from Cheryl. She said, most of our research is based on content in social studies and science. So how do you give them choices when you have specific material that's tested on the quote-unquote big and capital letters test?
Right, of course, the gigantic test. That's a perfect question. In my work with science and social studies teachers, one thing that we shift towards, and I think Stephanie Harvey and Harvey Daniels have a book, Comprehension and Collaboration.
Great stuff.
Yeah, and it's awesome. And I think they talk about this too, where what's important for us if we're building habits is that we take our topics and we make them umbrellas that kids are then researching inside of. So if we're inside the Great Depression, there's content that I, as the social studies teacher, want to teach, through videos, inquiry, everything else that I do. But when it comes time for student research, I want to divide up that topic into possibilities, or have kids divide up that topic as well. So to find their own interest inside of the larger umbrella. What tends to happen is they then get deeply invested inside of your topic, and you can supply the larger overarching connections while they're researching deep inside of a particular topic. So there still is choice, it's just kind of a controlled choice.
And as we transition into, what this looks like in our classroom and starting to talk about that, could Heidi asked if you could state the name of Steph Harvey's book again?
Yeah, it's Comprehension and Collaboration, Inquiry, Circles, and Action. It has a big light bulb on the cover.
Excellent. All right, so you're in your most recent book, Chris, that's coming out in October, I think, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
That book is Falling in Love with Close Reading. Lessons for Analyzing Texts and Life. It's co-authored with Kate Roberts. You've also been leading what you call a close reading kind of blogathon. Okay, I gotta admit I'm fairly tech savvy, but a blogathon. What the heck?
Right, exactly right. And thanks for including this in here because I know we have a short amount of time left. So what we're doing is for 7 weeks. I think we're in week 3 now, maybe 4. Kate and I, every Monday and Thursday, we're going back and forth. We're posting our own posts about close reading, but the blogathon part of it is that educators from around the country, actually there's some from around the world, are also writing their own posts and their own discussions and arguments or debates about this big initiative, this topic. And that shortened URL at the bottom there, the bit.ly, the bit.ly one, takes you to the page where we have lots of other educators writing about this topic. So we're kind of taking, for 7 weeks, we're doing a long bit of writing with anyone who'd like to join to try to talk more about the topic of close reading.
Well, Chris, you got a fan in the audience. Cheryl says she's been following it, and it's amazing.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl. I hope you've written something, Cheryl. I don't know if you have. If you haven't, then I'm now holding you to it. Yes, I'm publicly holding you to it now.
Calling her out. And folks, if you'll, quick reminder, this will be recorded, and so you can download and share this with your colleagues as we go through. Keep the questions and comments coming in. Leah's another fan of yours, Chris. She loves the blog, so we're going to call her out too, ask her to post if she hadn't already. So talk to me about close reading. I hear this phrase a lot, and other than holding the book closer to my face, I'm not really sure what you mean by that.
Exactly right. So I'm glad that we're talking about this. because again, I think this comes back to my major points here, that we need to provide time for feedback, and that if we aren't providing feedback, if we aren't creating that feedback loop, then we really aren't using instruction that moves our kids forward. Close reading is described in so many different ways, and in our short time, I just want to say my concern is anytime, and there are many of these, anytime there is a program or a artifact online or a worksheet or anything that claims to be close reading instruction that does not involve a great deal of student independence, a great deal of opportunities for teachers to get feedback, I just don't think it's useful. I really don't think it'll move our kids along. For example, there's some where literally, and I think I alluded to this earlier, there's 45 minutes of the teacher asking questions like, why was this word used on this line? Why was this other word used on that line? And I think for modeling, right? And I think for modeling's sake, fine. But if we're not using it to model, and instead that's our primary method of instruction is just asking questions to kids, I don't think that will move them along. So one thing that we came to in our blogathon and in our work on the book is one working definition of close reading that really could change. This is influenced by work of the Harvard Writing Center, of Doug Fisher, of Kylie Beers and Bob Probst in their work, and plenty of others that we've researched. And here's what I think close reading really is, what I've kind of come to. I believe close reading is when a reader independently stops at moments in a text, or it could be media, like someone asked earlier, or it could even be in your life too. You know, it could stop to really say, okay, what just happened in that conversation? And you independently decide to stop at a moment and reread it. And the reason why you reread that part is to observe the choices an author has made. You then, as that student or as that adult, you reflect on the observations you made to reach for new understandings. And those new understandings color the way the rest of the book is read. I think what this definition is also doing is it's kind of going against some of those other things I said. Like, I think close reading really is independent work, and our teaching has to lead towards that. I think it's always about rereading. I think it's always about trying to study choices that someone has made. Like, why did you choose that word? Why did you organize your instruction in that way? But ultimately, it has to lead to you developing a new understanding about what you're observing. If you're just doing it to do it, and it's not leaving you with a new idea, then I think it's an activity. It's not really instruction. And so sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've just got a couple of minutes left here, and I'd like to get you to talk a little bit about what this looks like in the classroom.
Sure. So I think one thing that this idea comes from my co-author, Kate Roberts, also a consultant and researcher herself. So one of the conversations around close reading is all ideas need to come from the four corners of the text. And that idea was that all of our thinking needs to come from whatever's on the page. And so what Kate writes about in one of the blog posts is that really there's 5 corners to close reading, that we cannot get away from Louise Rosenblatt's brilliant thinking about text interaction, that we have to think about ourselves as we read too. And so we actually don't agree that you can only say what's there on the text. All of us bring in our own ideas to a text. So if we're close reading nonfiction, for example, we're studying words that an author chose or details that they chose, but we also essentially bring in, what are things I'm confused about in this topic? Maybe I can look for details that support and kind of clarify that confusion. Or you say, I already know things about dinosaurs, so now I'm going to read this book about dinosaurs, and I'm going to look for details. I'm going to close read ideas that go against those ones that I had. And so yep.
So it sounds like we got to teach kids not just how to read, but how to think, kind of create some habits or training or habits of thought.
Yes, exactly right. And I think it's the repetition from the points we've said earlier, that it's really about their process. And so what we've come to in our book is really thinking about what are some habits that we can teach that lead to independence? What are some structures that we can teach kids to independently do themselves? And so with that, we kind of think of sort of like 3 major steps. That you first start deciding how you're going to read. So you're kind of choosing a lens. You're saying, I'm going to reread and look for word choice, or I'm going to look at structure, or I'm going to look at bias, or I'm going to look for things that I disagree with first. So you first start choosing a lens to read through. And so you reread looking through that lens. And once you've gathered up those details, you then look for patterns across them. This is the developing new understanding. So I look across all of those details and say, oh, this author has a tone here that I didn't notice before. Or, oh, that's what the word stalactite means. I didn't realize that, but now I've gathered all this evidence around it. And then a third step is then you have a new understanding. So it could be a clear understanding about the text, or it could be new analysis. And what I think is important there is in the book, we have these 3 steps. It really doesn't matter if you choose our 3 steps or not. I think what's more important, again, is you're creating some sort of structure that kids can study habits within so that you can study their work. By studying their work, it allows you to have more feedback.
Folks, I don't know about you, but I could continue this conversation with Chris all day long.
I know, this is fun. We should make this 5 hours long.
I'm thoroughly enjoying this and hope to have an opportunity to do it again. Please feel free to share this webinar. Again, go to our website, leadandlearn.com. In about 48 hours, this will be posted. If you'd like to continue the conversation, we'd love to carry this conversation on with you. Please feel free to reach out to me at tony.flock@hmh.co or contact Christopher via his website, christopherlehman.com. If you'd like to find out more about how we at the Center can help you implement the Common Core, contact Kyle Helfrich at hmhco.com. Folks, we at the Center do not believe in drive-by professional development, so please continue the conversation with us as we go from here. Chris, I just want to convey a couple of comments from our listeners today. Heidi said it's been great. She had to get back to her class someone's covering. Leah and Marjorie both said thank you for the webinar, and I'd like to extend my thanks as well. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you, Tony. I'm looking forward to November, where I'll be back with Leadership and Learning Center in New Orleans. And thank you, everyone, for squeezing in this little bit of time during your busy school day. I think conversation is the most important professional development, and I love that I had a chance to talk with you today, Tony. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time today, and do not hesitate to let us know how we can give you a hand. Have a wonderful rest of the day.